At 75, Edward's quiet life takes a dark turn when his children convince him to sell his home, leading to a shocking betrayal. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Edward had just turned 75, but he felt much younger. This happens when a person lives in peace with themselves and doesn't engage in conflict with the outside world. Edward lived in a small cottage that he had inherited from his parents, a place he cherished deeply. Throughout his life, he dreamed of becoming a writer, but at his advanced age, it became an unattainable goal. Edward tried not to dwell on this and kept hope for the future. Those who knew Edward understood the true reason behind his failures. The main problem was his children, who believed that others were responsible for their happiness. Laura and Michael were born just a year apart and were much loved by their parents. Everything went well until they became teenagers. Michael was the first to develop problems. He frequently got into trouble due to poor school performance and frequent absences. Some said Michael was involved in gambling and engaged in very suspicious activities at night. For some reason, the young man managed to escape everything. When the police got involved, Edward tried to talk to his son, but unfortunately, nothing good came from that educational moment. Sophia, Edward's wife, was the first to realize that her son would follow a questionable path of his own choosing. But like any mother, she continued to hope that he would improve and achieve something positive in his life. However, when their daughter Laura began following in her brother's footsteps, Sophia started to despair. She couldn't understand how her children had become simply unbearable. Of course, the parents made every effort to steer Michael and Laura in the right direction, but unfortunately, they were unsuccessful. Tired of yet another series of fights and confrontations, Sophia understood that she could no longer live that way. There had been disagreements between Sophia and Edward before, but it finally reached the point where they could no longer agree. Sophia decided that divorce was the best solution for their situation. Her decision left Edward in a severe state of shock. He had hoped they could help their children, but when left to deal with the problem alone, he realized that everything was doomed to fail. After the divorce, Edward faced real problems. His children, who had already strayed and barely graduated high school, refused to continue their studies and began living a life practically identical to that of delinquents. Laura and Michael abused alcohol and spent their father's hard-earned money. Rumors had it that Sophia started a new life, possibly even a successful business. Edward harbored no resentment toward her, knowing that he was also responsible for what had happened. Time passed, and Laura and Michael continued getting into many problems. Michael spent time in county jail, and Laura had several unsuccessful attempts at starting a family. Edward repeatedly asked his children to reflect on their future, but all was in vain. Eventually, Edward grew tired of his futile attempts to reason with his children and accepted reality. When he heard a knock on his front door, he immediately knew his son had come to ask for money. Being a kind and caring father, he never refused to help his children. He tried to give them everything to make them happy. Unfortunately, Laura and Michael's happiness depended solely on having access to money, which they used to buy alcohol and some food. Despite their age, the siblings didn't work and behaved as if they were the children of a millionaire. Meanwhile, Edward lived very modestly, trying to save some extra money for his children. Deep down, Edward understood that he could no longer influence his children. Therefore, he tried not to notice their oddities and not think too much about their lifestyle. "Hello, Dad, how are you?" Michael asked as soon as Edward opened the door. Edward began to open his mouth to respond, but was immediately interrupted. "I can see that you're doing well. You even bought a new chair." Edward lowered his eyes and felt embarrassed. He had indeed bought a new chair because he could no longer sit comfortably on the old one due to back pain. After entering their father's house, Michael and Laura started walking around, examining and measuring each room. Edward didn't immediately understand what they were doing, but when he found out, he began to feel uncomfortable. "You know you have arthritis and need money for treatment, and you really don't need such a big house," Laura began to say. Edward wanted to say something, but Michael continued where his sister left off. He started complaining about his bad luck and a loan he had taken from the bank, though he didn't say what the loan was for. Edward wasn't in the habit of controlling his children's every step. After all, his daughter's health was at stake, and Michael could also suffer if he didn't pay off the loan. With his criminal record, he could even go to prison. "So, what should I do?" Edward asked. "You don't have to do anything. We've already taken care of everything. We've arranged a place for you in a retirement community. There you can spend time with people your age and not worry about the future. You'll always have food and clean clothes," Michael said. Edward considered Michael's words. He didn't want to leave his house at this age, but he also didn't feel comfortable not helping his children. Maybe the retirement community wasn't such a bad idea. There was some reason in what Michael was saying. Otherwise, who would take care of him in his old age? Edward thought he would have a week or two to pack, but Michael insisted that they pack up immediately. "What will happen to my dog?" Edward asked anxiously. "We've already taken care of that and found a place for him in an animal shelter," Laura replied immediately. Edward felt incredibly bad and guilty because Buddy, his loyal friend for over 10 years, would be forced to live out his days in an animal shelter. But on the other hand, Laura's health was at risk, and Edward wasn't willing to sacrifice it. So he began to pack his bags sadly. In reality, he didn't have much to pack. He lived modestly and rarely bought new things. The chair was one of the only new things he had purchased in a long time, but it wasn't something he could take with him. "It's okay, Dad. We'll ask the new owners of the house to buy the chair from you," Laura reassured her father. On the way to the retirement community, Edward felt very uncomfortable. He was worried about whether he would fit in at the institution and make friends. Meanwhile, Laura and Michael were thinking about something completely different. The conspirators were already mentally dividing the money they would receive from selling the house. Laura didn't have financial problems, and Michael hadn't taken out a loan from the bank. It was all a scheme to swindle their father out of his money. They had already found buyers and just needed to get their father out of the house. To Edward's surprise, the retirement community was actually very pleasant. He was immediately surrounded by care, acceptance, and attention. Of course, the institution couldn't replace a real home, but it was certainly better than many other places where elderly people ended up. As they said their goodbyes, Laura and Michael promised to visit their father in a few days. In reality, however, they had no plans to visit him. After selling the house, Laura and Michael plunged into an abyss of drinking and endless parties with their friends and acquaintances. The money they received from selling the house didn't last long. At the same time, they didn't realize that their father had basically nothing left to sell. 2 weeks flew by like a single day for Laura and Michael. Waking up from yet another binge, they realized that there was no more money and something needed to be done. That's when Laura suggested they ask for their father's life savings, some of which he had set aside for his funeral. Being a prudent and organized man, Edward had always kept a certain amount of money saved to cover funeral expenses in case he passed away. Probably many people do this, and Edward was no exception. Michael really liked Laura's idea, as easy money always tempted him. While the siblings were coming up with another story to tell their father, Edward was working in a plot of land located behind the retirement community. It's worth noting that the retirement community was located in an incredibly beautiful area. It was difficult to build a house there. Only a few privileged people could afford to buy land in that location. Edward put on his gardening gloves and started planting roses and removing last year's leaves from the lawn. At that moment, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a woman heading toward a 2-story house located half a kilometer from the retirement community. Edward knew that rich people could afford to have a house in such a coveted area. The woman's face looked familiar to Edward. "Sophia, is that you?" Edward exclaimed in surprise. The woman stopped and looked at Edward, who was dressed in a work uniform. At that moment, a sweet smile appeared on her lips, and Edward knew it was really her. "Yes, it's me. How did you end up here?" Sophia asked, still incredulous. Edward shifted from one foot to the other, and began to explain that he had sold the house to pay for Laura's treatment and Michael's debts. After hearing her ex-husband, Sophia turned pale. Unlike Edward, she didn't believe Michael or Laura's stories. Therefore, without saying a word, she immediately called her private investigator, who handled all kinds of delicate matters. It turned out that after divorcing Edward, Sophia started a successful business and eventually became quite wealthy. By chance, they lived together for only a short time before the businessman died, leaving his wife a large inheritance. Of course, Michael and Laura didn't know that their mother was wealthy and lived in a house that cost a fortune. After saying goodbye to Edward, Sophia promised to visit him soon and find the warmest places for him. Deep down, he still loved her and hoped that one day they could return to their old lives. Sophia's investigation revealed that Laura and Michael had deceived Edward and had already squandered the money they received from selling the house. At the same time, the cunning children didn't suspect that Sophia would tell Edward the truth when she visited him. By the time they came to see their father, Edward already knew about their deception. "Dad, we need a little more money," Laura began, to Michael's great surprise. Edward shook his head and said he wouldn't give them anything. "Dad, what do you mean?" Laura was shocked. At that moment, Sophia suddenly appeared. Michael and Laura became visibly uncomfortable. The siblings realized that their lies had been uncovered and that no more money would be coming their way. Furthermore, Sophia and Edward decided to live together again. "Live as you wish, but forget the way to our house," Sophia said to the children as she left. Laura and Michael took a long time to recover from what they had seen. They couldn't believe their eyes as they watched Sophia and Edward walk away. Despite their age, the couple decided to start over, and now they had everything they couldn't even dream of before. Their lives would undoubtedly change for the better. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.